We are fundamentally obsessed with a particularly cruel, pervasive myth regarding human suffering. The belief that the sheer passage of time possesses a magical, intrinsic property capable of erasing emotional pain. When you experience a devastating loss, when a monumental relationship crashes and burns, or when you are brutally betrayed by someone you trusted entirely, the collective advice you receive is always identical. Just give it time. Time eventually heals all wounds. You simply have to be patient with the process. And so, you wait. You endure months of agonizing memories. You endure years of a dull, heavy ache settling deep into your chest. You believe you are actively participating in a noble, necessary period of processing and healing. You believe that by meticulously analyzing every microscopic detail of what failed, you are moving closer to a profound resolution. This is the most devastating, energy-draining fabrication of modern pop psychology. Time does absolutely nothing but pass. That is its singular function. The agonizing truth that no one prepares you for is that time does not heal you. If you continue to unconsciously execute the exact same neuropsychological habits you formed while the relationship existed, time is not healing you at all. Time is actively, tenaciously feeding the wound. Time is building a colossal monument to a ghost. Have you ever wondered why some exceptionally rare individuals possess the terrifying ability to let go of devastating situations almost instantaneously? While you remain trapped in an inescapable labyrinth of rumination for agonizing years, they appear to seamlessly unplug their emotional matrix from a person, a betrayal, or a massive failure, and simply continue walking forward as if the event was nothing more than a passing breeze. You label them cold. You label them heartless. But what if they merely possess a profound, brutal understanding of the mechanics of the human mind that you completely lack? What if they understand that letting go is not a slow, passive bleeding of emotion, but a ruthless, highly active neurological execution? Today we are going completely beyond the superficial advice of moving on. We are diving deep into the absolute cold logic of the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius and the dark, unyielding depth psychology of Carl Jung to dissect precisely why you are fundamentally incapable of moving forward. We will reveal the terrifying anatomy of emotional attachment, and we will teach you the exact mechanism required to detach from absolutely anyone or anything with a speed that will shock both you and the people who previously held power over you. If you are utterly exhausted from dragging the decaying corpse of your past relationships into every new interaction, then sit in silence. You are about to learn how to sever the chain permanently. To achieve total detachment, you must first comprehend the brutal reality of what you are actually stubbornly attached to. You believe with absolute certainty that you cannot let go of a specific, tangible human being. You long for their voice, their physical presence, the agonizingly specific way they made you feel secure, seen, or valued. But from the perspective of Carl Jung, you are not engaging with reality whatsoever. You are actively engaging with a phantom. Jung postulated that human beings are deeply governed by unconscious psychological images. When we enter into profoundly significant relationships, our psyche does not merely log objective data about the other person. Instead, we project immense, overwhelming quantities of our own unrecognized internal energy, our anima or animus, onto them. We overlay their actual flawed human reality with a magnificent, idealized psychological template of our own creation. We construct a glittering avatar of fulfillment and paste it directly over their face. When the relationship inevitably shatters, or the person profoundly disappoints you, you are confronted with an agonizing cognitive dissonance. The person standing in front of you, cold, distant, betraying, or simply fundamentally incompatible, does not match the glorious internal template you constructed. Your inability to let go is simply the violent, terrified refusal of your ego to accept the death of that phantom. You are entirely trapped, mourning a hallucination. You spend staggering amounts of mental energy scrolling through their social media, analyzing cryptic text messages, or engaging in endless, brutal postmortems with your friends. You convince yourself that you are seeking closure. You believe you are attempting to understand why they acted the way they did. This is a brilliant, devastating deception, orchestrated entirely by your own mind to avoid the finality of grief. The brutal truth is that every single second you dedicate to deeply analyzing their motives, their flaws, or the mythical what could have been, you are simultaneously pumping high-voltage electrical current directly into the corpse of the phantom to keep it twitching. In the precise language of depth psychology, you are deliberately supplying the entity with libido, psychological energy. You assume your obsessive thoughts are the result of an uncontrollable infection, a symptom of the heartbreak. They are not. The obsessive thoughts are the active administration of the disease. You are desperately attempting to keep the relationship alive within the absolute safety of your own skull, simply because it is infinitely less terrifying than facing the deafening, empty silence of a genuine end. And as long as you continually feed the phantom with your focused attention, letting go is a neurological, psychological impossibility. You are trying to starve a monster while simultaneously hand-feeding it every single hour of the day. If Carl Jung accurately maps the psychological trap, Marcus Aurelius provides the ruthless, cold steel blade required to cut your way out. Stoicism is not a philosophy of emotional suppression. It is a philosophy of supreme emotional governance. It is the absolute, unyielding mastery of drawing a permanent, impenetrable border between what you demonstrably control and what you fundamentally do not. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire beset by devastating plagues, massive betrayals, and constant warfare, wrote extensively in his private journals about the aggressive discipline of his own perception. He recognized that human suffering does not originate from the external event itself. It exclusively originates from the internal, agonizing narrative the mind constructs regarding the event. You say, "This person completely destroyed my life." Marcus Aurelius would look at you with total, absolute indifference and instantly correct the horrific error in your logic. No, this person left. That is the objective physical reality. Your unhinged, spiraling belief that possessing them was a fundamental mandatory requirement for your happiness is the only thing currently destroying your life. Detachment is not the heroic suppression of profound love or anger. Detachment is the systematic, calculated destruction of an incorrect, toxic narrative. Observe the stories you aggressively rehearse every single time you feel the agonizing sting of their absence. You tell yourself, "I will never find a connection like that again. I gave them the best years of my life and received nothing but trauma. If I had only behaved slightly differently, things would be perfect." These statements are not objective facts. They are vicious, self-inflicted psychological wounds. They are the desperate wailing of a weak ego, begging the universe to reverse the immutable flow of time. To detach instantly, you must adopt the brutal, cold composure of a military commander surveying a lost battlefield. When a tactical position is completely overrun, a master strategist does not weep over the lost ground. They immediately, ruthlessly recalculate their strategy based entirely on the new, brutal reality. The Stoic does not negotiate with grief. The Stoic accepts the definitive loss of the asset, cuts off all supply lines to the fallen territory, and massively reinforces the central command structure. This requires an active, spectacular, violent mental discipline. The precise second the thought of that person enters your consciousness, you must not follow it down the labyrinth of memory. You must not allow the emotional cascade to sequentially initiate. You must visualize a heavy steel door violently slamming shut on the thought. You acknowledge the external event occurred, but you absolutely refuse to allow the event to colonize your internal empire for another millisecond. Aurelius famously wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been." This is the ultimate, terrifying power of the mind. By actively refusing to participate in the mental rehearsal of your own tragedy, you instantly rip the power cord out of the wall. The memory still exists, objectively, in the archive of your past, but you have severed its ability to generate an emotional, physiological reaction in your present. It ceases to be an agonizing, bleeding wound, and immediately becomes a piece of cold, dead, historical data. When you finally initiate this brutal, stoic severance, you will immediately encounter the most terrifying phase of detachment. It is not the pain of missing them that will paralyze you. It is an overwhelming, suffocating sense of complete and utter emptiness. You will feel as if a massive, foundational chunk of your own personality has been cleanly excised. This terror brings us back to Carl Jung and the intricate architecture of the persona. We rarely exist as authentic, fully realized individuals in our deep relationships. We exist as highly specialized roles. You were the fixer. You were the rock. You were the muse. You were the person who endured, or the person who saved them. You constructed a massive, complex psychological infrastructure around that specific interaction. It dictated your daily routines, your weekend plans, your sense of fundamental purpose, and aggressively structured your internal value system. When you suddenly sever the connection to the other person, that entire massive infrastructure abruptly, instantly collapses. You are no longer their anything. And this triggers a profound, terrifying identity crisis. This is the exact reason why ordinary people relapse. They run screaming back to their toxic partners, or rebound wildly into immediately identical disastrous dynamics, not out of profound love, but out of sheer, unadulterated terror of the void. They would rather fiercely suffer the familiar agony of an abusive or dead relationship than face the absolute, echoing silence of no longer knowing exactly who they are supposed to be. Letting go is not merely walking away from a physical person. It is the forced, violent resignation from a psychological job you have held for years. Therefore, total, instantaneous detachment requires more than just stopping the flow of obsessive thoughts. It requires an aggressive, immediate psychological restructuring. If you remove a load-bearing pillar from a building without quickly compensating for the massive structural deficit, the roof will inevitably cave in. When you choose to detach, you must deliberately, fiercely, step into the horrifying emptiness. You must not immediately rush to fill the void with a new relationship, staggering amounts of alcohol, or 50 hours of meaningless distraction. You must sit in the absolute epicenter of the ruin and ruthlessly begin the process of individuation. The energy that you previously hemorrhaged outward, simply to maintain your toxic role in their life, must be aggressively recalled and redirected toward forging a new, terrifyingly dense internal axis. The sudden, agonizing free time must be weaponized. The frantic, obsessive energy must be transmuted into grueling physical discipline, intense intellectual expansion, or the aggressive, quiet building of an entirely new empire. When you are obsessively focused on meticulously crafting an identity, completely disconnected and fiercely independent from their previous existence, the memory of them begins to rapidly shrink in exactly the same way a distant city disappears in the rearview mirror of a car accelerating at maximum speed. They do not fade because you aggressively forced yourself to forget. They fade organically because they simply have absolutely no relevance to the monumental structure you are actively constructing today. The mind is incredibly powerful, but it is deeply tethered to the physical environment. Carl Jung recognized that our habits, our triggers, and our deeply grooved emotional patterns are heavily anchored in the spaces we consistently inhabit. If you attempt extreme mental detachment while remaining embedded in the exact same physical and behavioral matrix that initially gave birth to the connection, your failure is virtually guaranteed. Attachment is not a purely abstract concept. It is an established, physical, neurological rhythm. When you decide to detach, you cannot act tentatively. You cannot execute half measures. You must act with the sheer, unapologetic violence of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb to save the patient's life. You cannot aggressively maintain contact just as friends and expect the emotional bleeding to cease. You cannot sleep in the same exact arrangements, follow the same exact daily digital loops, and expect your brain to miraculously sever a deeply entrenched neural pathway simply because you willed it to be so. True detachment requires a total scorched earth protocol regarding your personal environment. It requires the absolute, unapologetic excision of anything that acts as a physical anchor to the phantom you are killing. This is the phase that deeply frightens weak individuals. They interpret the total deletion of photos, the permanent blocking of phone numbers, and the deliberate alteration of daily geographic routes as an admission of their own unbearable weakness or an act of petty spite. The master understands this is the ultimate act of high-level psychological warfare enacted on oneself. You are entirely reshaping your environment so that your brain is given a massive, uninterrupted runway for the installation of new programming. By aggressively removing the external stimuli, you are permanently depriving the unconscious of its ability to initiate the emotional cascade entirely on autopilot. You are aggressively enforcing absolute radio silence, so your inner voice can finally be heard above the deafening, frantic noise of your own addiction. When you combine a radically altered external environment with the unyielding, cold steel of Stoic mental discipline, you construct a scenario where the old attachment is quite literally starved to death. It has no mental energy to consume and no physical triggers to reawaken its dormant state. The speed at which an obsession dies when it is entirely deprived of all oxygen is staggering to witness. How do we take this terrifying synthesis of Jungian depth psychology and Stoic brutality and implement it immediately into our chaotic, pain-ridden lives? This is the protocol for instant, absolute detachment. Not for gradual healing, not for gentle moving on, for the complete nuclear obliteration of the attachment. Rule 1 is the absolute embargo on the narrative. Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from telling the tragic story of the relationship's failure. You do not discuss it with friends. You do not analyze their motives in your journal. You do not search the internet for articles concerning their alleged personality disorders. Every time you open your mouth to complain, you are desperately pouring concrete onto the foundation of the phantom. Cut the supply line. Let the story die entirely of sheer, uncompromising neglect. Rule 2 is the deployment of the Stoic wall. When the agonizing, obsessive thought inevitably attempts to infiltrate your mind, you do not engage with it. You do not argue with it. You visualize a massive iron gate slamming shut. You say a single command: irrelevant. You recognize the physical sensation in your chest. You accept the adrenaline spike as a passing, irrelevant chemical reaction. And you immediately, aggressively, force your attention onto a highly demanding physical or intellectual task. You train your brain like you train a feral animal. This specific pathway is now permanently closed for business. Rule 3 is the scorched earth environmental cleansing. If a physical or digital object exists exclusively to trigger a response tied to this specific individual, it must be eradicated within the hour. Block numbers, archive or delete photos, discard physical mementos. Do not preserve them for a future date where you believe you will be healed enough to look at them. Burn the bridges entirely, so that the weak, terrified part of your ego has absolutely no mechanism to initiate a retreat when the isolation becomes unbearably heavy. Rule 4 is the aggressive cultivation of the self. You must take the staggering volume of time, energy, and obsessive focus you are wasting on an entity completely outside of your control, and violently redirect every single drop of it toward building an empire entirely within your control. You begin lifting heavier weights. You plunge into learning complex theories. You execute a massive undertaking in your career. You make your current, immediate, objective reality so dense, so captivating, and so intensely demanding that the ghost of the past simply lacks the gravitational pull to capture your attention ever again. When you enforce this brutal, uncompromising discipline, you will experience an entirely unfamiliar sensation. It is not merely relief. It is the terrifying, intoxicating, cold blast of absolute freedom. You suddenly realize with absolute clarity that you are entirely responsible for manufacturing your own prison, and therefore, you possess the supreme authority to dismantle it at will. The crushing weight you were carrying was never the actual individual. The crushing weight was the agonizing resistance of your ego refusing to accept reality. When you drop that resistance, when you completely sever the psychological cord, you become incredibly dangerous to the manipulative mechanics of the world. You instantly transform into a sovereign entity, someone who cannot be effectively threatened with abandonment because you have flawlessly demonstrated your willingness to execute the amputation completely on your own terms. The belief that time slowly and gently heals our deepest psychological wounds is a comforting, pathetic bedtime story for those entirely unwilling to conduct the brutal surgery required for true freedom. Detachment is not a passive waiting game. Detachment is the supreme act of psychological violence committed against your own illusions. It is standing in the absolute center of the wreckage, looking the phantom directly in the eyes, and decisively pulling the plug on its life support. If these brutal truths have resonated with the quiet war you have been losing inside your own mind, it is time to cease negotiating with your pain. It is time to execute the protocol. Do not wait for closure from those who entirely lack the capacity to provide it. You are the architect of the only closure that possesses any actual merit. If you are finally ready to stop dragging the rotting corpses of your past into your desperately needed future, subscribe to this channel. The path of the shadow thinker is isolated, unforgiving, and exceptionally cold. But the view from the top of the empire is entirely unobstructed. Stop waiting for them to fade. Erase them deliberately and begin building yourself.